Cool. So Ben, a huge welcome. Thank you for being here with us today. So Ben, you are currently the CTO for Onto. And Onto is an electric vehicle subscription company. Before becoming CTO, you fulfilled a number of senior engineering positions at a number of other high-profile brands such as Capita, Gusto, QuickBooks, now part of Intuit. So clearly, you've got a proven pedigree as a revered engineering and tech leader. And I personally have been very much looking forward to today's episode because, as you know, Ben, from our previous chats, I am an Onto customer of yours. So, really looking forward to hearing more about your role and, some of the, no doubt, challenges you faced along the way and some interesting projects that you're tackling over there at Onto. But before we get onto that, see what I did there? Let's talk a little bit about you. So your background and ultimately what sort of led you into a position of tech leadership. So if you'd like to give us a bit of an overview of your background, that would be superb.
Perfect. Yeah, certainly will do. Well, thank you for having me on the podcast. Great to be here, and certainly looking forward to the conversation. As I know you as a customer can talk in detail about how you what you love about Onto as well. So
and I will.
So I think you're right. I've been a CTO at Onto just under 2.5 years now. Joined the business as they were going through a Series B funding round and kind of really looking to I guess grow and scale the organisation. And so it's been a very interesting couple of years. I think probably some of the most challenging years in the automotive sector, from supply shortages to chip shortages to the challenges of coming out of COVID. So it's certainly been a very interesting couple of years working with Onto. But over that time, we've definitely put in place grown the team, put in place some really great ways of working, and kind of hopefully put out there some really great features for our customers. My background is very, I guess, traditional in a sense. I came from the engineering background, did a computer science degree back up in York many years ago now. And during that degree, found myself in a placement year, and actually ended up working for Lehman Brothers during that placement year, working on their fixed income credit trading platforms. And I guess I saw that as a really great interview, if you like. I'd spent a year there. I'd enjoyed it. They'd enjoyed working with me, and ultimately got an offer to join them back on their graduate scheme. And as many of you might remember, that was 2007, 2008 was a seminal year.
Wasn't your fault, was it?
I hope not. I hope not. It's not been tracked back to me yet, but let's see. It's 2008 was definitely an interesting year. At the end of my graduate scheme year, I was actually on what we called early support that day, on that Monday morning, and came to the office, saw a photographer stood outside the office, walked into the office, hadn't really looked at the news at this point in time. My boss and my boss's boss talking to each other in the middle of the floor, and I think I've come to realise that's probably not a good sign. And this is like 7:30 in the morning, so pretty early. And ultimately we found out we'd gone into administration on that day. So a very interesting start to my career, but very much an engineer at that stage. And as you said, I've kind of gone on that journey, and in my next role kind of went through that journey from engineer to technical leader to people leader. I've never looked back since.
Fair dues. So you were there literally at ground zero of the global meltdown. I did not know that.
It certainly gives you a different reality check when a lot of people kind of suggest things like startups are more risky, or there's more challenges there, or these sorts of things. I kind of go, well, I worked for a 150-year-old bank, and unfortunately that went bankrupt in the first year of me working. So it's kind of a little bit can be varied in terms of the experience there.
Yeah, very true. So I guess you've obviously worked for, like, say, bigger financial institutions like Lehman Brothers, and then gone on to, companies like Gusto, Onto. Have you? What was important to you, I guess, when considering an opportunity as to what kind of company you joined?
Yeah, I think over time it's probably something that I've matured and changed in. I think, when I was an engineer, I think you were very much definitely looking at the problems you were solving, what actual code you were going to write, the technologies you were going to work with. And I'd say, a lot of those things in terms of technologies and those sorts of things become very unimportant to me now. I've worked in various different technology stacks, and frankly, I don't see it being that much of a challenge to move between them. You can still ask the same questions. I think what is important for me is definitely the culture of the organisation. I've worked in some organisations where I've really got on well with the culture, and other organisations where I perhaps haven't gotten on as well with the culture. And that certainly is something that not only draws me in, but then keeps me for the long term. And I think the important things about that culture is, ultimately somewhere that it creates a great place to work for people. And I've been reflecting over the last 6 months, 9 months about what my purpose in my career is outside of working for the organisations. And one of the things I've certainly come across is this idea that my purpose really is to create the environment that allows people to do the best work of their lives. And so I think that's really what I'm looking for in a culture and of the values that an organisation creates. And that's probably the strongest thing that draws me in. And then secondly, I think it's very much about the challenges that organisation will have. I'm certainly not in a position where I'm looking for, if you like, an easy ride. I think challenge brings growth, and certainly growth is a very important value for me and something that I certainly seek out in those roles.
Cool. Yeah, I love that. I mean, it's great to hear that you've sort of got that visibility, I guess, around what's important to you as a leader, and ultimately, because let's face it, not everybody that's a fantastic engineer will make it into leadership or really wants to make it into leadership. Nope. So talk me through for you then. What do you feel are in your leadership style, what do you feel are the most valuable qualities and traits of a leader, and how do you enable people to do the best work of their lives?
Yeah, so I think I look at some basic principles. I think when I think about this, and I think one of the areas I get a big piece from is the kind of Daniel Pink Drive book, Autonomy, Mastery, Purpose. Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in terms of those three aspects, and I do base a lot of what I do around that. And autonomy, I think, is extremely important for individuals, and so I think about that in terms of setting people problems to solve rather than giving them solutions. I never see my teams happier than when they're working with stakeholders to understand what this problem is and how they can solve it. And I probably never see them more disappointed when somebody says, "Hey, look, I just want you to build this." Yeah. And that's across engineering, product design, any of the disciplines that kind of sit within the team. I think on the mastery front, I think we're lucky enough to work in a technology environment where it's constantly moving, it's constantly changing, and growth and learning are a really important aspect to that. And I think we're lucky that most of the people who come into their roles really want to grow and develop and scale themselves. So they want to be masters of that environment. And I think it is important to create an environment that recognises that's important. Now, I think it's fair to say I've also worked for high growth startups, companies that move very quickly, and so there's always a balance. But it is definitely important that you allow people to have that feeling of mastery and find a way so that they can succeed with that. And then on the purpose front, I think a lot of that purpose perhaps comes from the organisation they're working for, the problems that we're solving. I'm very lucky at Onto that I think our purpose, which is really to kind of help that transition to EV vehicles, is something that people believe in a lot. I think we've hired a lot of people who have want to work in an industry that's doing good for the world, and so we've been able to certainly attract people much easier than I have been in some industries that are kind of similar size of organisation. So I think that's certainly important for people. But I also know people who get their purpose just from solving the problems that they're doing on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't really matter what the industry is, and that's also, I think, perfectly fine. Yeah, very good point. It's interesting you mentioned that Dan Pink book. I remember watching a video on YouTube probably about 10 years ago now. It was like the kind of pencil drawing. Have you seen it? Yep.
Pencil drawing, and it actually like really hit me like a bolt out of the blue of, actually really that is what strong leadership is, isn't it? And it's sort of a bit counterintuitive really that historically there's been that view of leadership is being prescriptive, it's being authoritative, it's sort of telling people what they need to do. And actually, I think you're dead right about that autonomy piece. I think is one of the most important things, for a strong leader. But it's also really interesting how I think that transcends a lot of industries as well. I can totally relate to your examples there within tech, but it actually feels as relevant and as current in kind of a recruitment environment as well. I think it's a very good sort of bedrock of strong leadership in my opinion. So, interesting.
I think we can recognise that this has changed quite a lot over the past probably 15, 20 years. It's not the way it used to be. And I think there's some organizations that have bought into that and changed, and there's other organizations that haven't. And
Very much
ultimately,
so.
as you speak to those organizations and perhaps apply for roles at those organizations, you realize where they sit on that spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, it's to really achieve something special and achieve, I think, scale. That autonomy piece, I think, is really, really important, because I think you can obviously achieve a certain amount by telling people what to do and getting people that are just very, will listen to you and actually obey, but actually to really go on and achieve something special and kind of create a business which is sustainable and organic. And, I think it is so much about, allowing people to be creative, allowing people to have that autonomy and input on an individual level. And I think you're dead right. Certainly in the recruitment space anyway, there's certain companies that have really adopted that. And I'd like to think True North is absolutely one of those businesses. But there's a lot of other companies which shall not be named, which still have this very draconian kind of, mentality to don't think for yourself, just shut up, sit there and do the job. And it, fail to see how that's ever going to scale past a certain point, I totally agree. Cool. So, as a tech leader, you sort of spoke about development there, and look, obviously the world of technology is developing at an unbelievably rapid pace. I think it's fair to say, if we just look at the last couple of years alone. As a CTO, I'm always really interested, especially people like yourself that have come from that engineering background. We've clearly had a strong understanding, of engineering principles, and that obviously has allowed you to progress into the CTO role. At some point, I suppose you take your hand off the tiller a little bit of being too close to the coalface technically, and obviously now start maturing your skills in other areas. But how do you remain current as a CTO? How do you sort of keep on track with the emerging trends in the market? And I suppose to that end, what are you most excited about in the world that we live in now in terms of some of the emerging trends technically?
Yeah, so I think staying in touch, because the industry is moving so quickly, has always been tough. I think it's tough for engineers. I often joked when when I was an engineer, I pretty much was full stack because you had to be at that point in time. Nowadays, I'm not sure how a front end engineer stays up to date with every single framework, library, and thing that kind of pops out there. So it's just very difficult.
Yeah,
I think my method has always been a kind of a combination of things. I think first of all, it's I think certain newsletters, articles, places to kind of read things that I've become used to reading. So I think InfoQ is a great kind of technical resource. They put some great kind of web kind of newsletters out there that allow people to get far more kind of insight, and it allows me to kind of almost flick through and see kind of what are people talking about, where do I perhaps want to dig into deeply. I think as I've moved more into that CTO role and more of a cross-functional leader, it's things like HBR has been Harvard Business Review has been a more frequent reader of things like that, articles that pop up in there. I think there's certainly from the startup community, there's a lot of kind of startup newsletters that are particularly interesting to do. So I think just broad is probably the main way. I think I probably have to stay far more broad than deep these days, because it's just impossible to go deep in all the different topics.
Of course, yeah.
I think in terms of what excites me and what am I excited about, it's very much. AI is the big topic, isn't it? I mean, if I didn't mention AI, then we
wouldn't be a podcast.
It wouldn't be a tech podcast.
Yeah.
So I think AI is an interesting one for me. I think I in general, I'm an optimist. But I'm also, I think, a realist, and therefore I do understand that there's the potential to do a lot of harm, but also the potential to do a lot of good. And I hope that we work our way through this, and I hope that we get to a position where this really truly does kind of power the next industrial revolution, if you like, and kind of takes us through to that next level of productivity and ultimately transforms a number of jobs which probably never were as efficient as they could be. So I do have a lot of hope for AI. I think I also understand how early we are, and I think I think I have a broad terms of experience and outlook at this. When I look at things that I see online, I see people talking about it, and I see the positives, and I also see the negatives. And I think there is a big marketing piece around this now. If you're not saying that you're an AI company, you're not getting an extra zero on your valuation.
Absolutely.
You're not getting out there. You're not getting kind of invested in by VCs. And there is this is a pattern that I think we've seen before with crypto and blockchain and those sorts of things. And I think my view is we'll go through some of that again. And if you like, on the path of development. We'll go to the trough of disillusionment at some point, and we'll realize that there's positivity here, but we also need to kind of work through this and make that work at scale.
Yeah.
I think one of the areas that I am particularly excited about in terms of an AI perspective is probably I don't think AI will replace the need for talented technologists, but I think it can massively augment their jobs and remove some of the boilerplate that happens.
Yeah.
The last couple of years, especially at Onto, we've been exploring a lot of low-code automation tools, and I think that's one of the things that's helped us to go faster in certain areas that we wouldn't be able to without a bigger team or more engineers. And I think what excites me is that the challenge with these no-code tools is fitting them into everything else that you have in your stack, making them work, making them have the same levels of resilience that perhaps some of your high-code or full code tools do. And I think AI can really kind of help to bridge that gap. It can really help us to kind of remove some of the repetitive work. I never liked being an engineer and writing the basic code to create entities, to connect to databases, to do all that sort of stuff. And when I was an engineer, it was the Spring framework that was doing a lot of work to kind of move away from needing to write that boilerplate code. Yeah. But I think there's still a lot of it gets written, and I think AI can really help engineers to remove that piece of their jobs. And I hope most engineers realize that's not really what they're paid for. What they're paid for is their brain and the problems that they can solve. So I really, that's where I'm really positive about this, and I think we can make some great strides.
Yeah, I totally agree. I look at it in very similar ways myself. That there's no point sitting here saying that we are where we are now as far as technology and AI, and it's only going one way. It's not going backwards. So rather than sort of fearing and worrying for the worst, okay, yes, of course, like I say, we do need to have a real strong focus and emphasis on the ethics part of it. But fundamentally, the system will be using AI tools in a more efficient way moving forward. And I totally agree. Just want to look at it from a recruitment perspective. I still feel that there will always be a need for human input at some point throughout the process, especially in recruitment, because I guess people want to work with people, and it's a people industry. So, but in technology, I also agree that technology, I suppose, is there to make life easier for people, and that's essentially what it does do. But at some point, there will still need to be that touch point of that engineer at the end of that, and that output, and sort of understanding, okay, this is how we use that in that certain scenario. And I don't think that context. I think we're very far away from that context ever being replaced. So I look at it in a very positive light as well. But let's talk a little bit more about your role at Onto at the moment then.
Sure.
And I guess Onto as a service, I mean, I certainly had never come across anything like it before I started working with it, in terms of, I guess, its level of simplicity, but also flexibility. It's one of the real big selling points for me. So talk me through, what's it like being CTO there, and I guess we'll get on to some of the sort of specific, unique challenges no doubt you face in the world of the EV world at the moment. But just as an overview, what's it like as the CTO of a business like Onto?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd say is never boring. It's certainly an environment where there is lots of change happening. There's lots of challenges occurring economically, lots of challenges occurring, say, the car industry wise. So it certainly keeps me interested and gives us some interesting challenges. My role's pretty broad at Onto. Although my title's CTO, I also look after product design as well, as kind of the engineering, IT, and data, which you'd perhaps get as a traditional CTO role. And I think what I've really enjoyed about that and really loved about that is that actually ultimately you can only deliver great product by bringing all those things together. And so one of the things it does make simpler in the organization is we don't have the challenges or the politics of multiple leaders potentially pulling in different directions, which I've certainly seen in perhaps other organizations that I've worked for. It comes with some challenges. I think the downside to that model is probably that at some stage you need to bring in people below you who have massive amounts of experience in that area, because I'm never going to be the expert in all of those different areas, and therefore you have to work with those experts. I think we've had a very interesting couple of years, scaled the business a lot, grown the amount of cars that we have out on the system. And I think the interesting thing in a couple of my roles that I had is my this balance of digital and physical product. So I had this at Gusto also. Gusto, obviously, a physical recipe box company, and Onto, obviously, on the car front. And that brings an extra level of interest to any problems you've got to solve, because with it's a digital-only product, you're your ability to fix problems or address problems is relatively easy. You can fix the data, you can kind of fix the challenges, say sorry to the customer, compensate them if necessary, and then kind of move on. If we don't deliver a car on the day, that car does not arrive, and there's no way to magically arrive in kind of 10 minutes. We have to physically move a car from one place to another again, and that takes time. And so I think this does cause an interesting set of problems. I think the other thing that's been really interesting about Onto is, unlike many subscription businesses where your kind of interaction once you've done the subscription is relatively minor. So again, back to Gusto, the challenges at Gusto were probably in terms of how do you fulfill these boxes at scale? How do you kind of get the right choice of meals to people? But once the box arrives, assuming everything's arrived in kind of satisfactory condition, that's kind of done until that person orders their next box.
Yeah.
With a car, that car has lots of things that can go wrong with it. So that could be everything from tires breaking, windscreens breaking, keys getting lost, insurance events happening, damage occurring. All of this stuff is quite messy.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what we've been thinking about over the past couple of years is like, how do we truly transform this to make it really easy and simple? And I think some areas we've been successful in, some areas we're still definitely working on those. We're definitely not where we want to be, because ultimately we do see ourselves as a service that people are paying quite a lot of money for. It's probably one of the more expensive things in life that you're going to have after a house is probably a car, and therefore there's a lot of money that goes into that, and therefore we do want people to feel it is a premium service. So we've done a lot of work in that. I think some of the examples we could perhaps pick out in the last few months. Servicing has always been a little bit of a problem because with servicing you essentially put that customer back into a different a network outside of your control. We don't do our own services. We send cars to garages.
Okay.
We try and do services when a car is between customers, but that's not always possible. Sometimes it gets to that point and a customer's got a car, has no intention of giving it up. We have to service that car. So one of the things we've been working with the RAC on is bringing a mobile service. So we can service that on your drive. Actually, EVs are far easier to service, far less moving parts.
True,
Therefore, why couldn't we bring something to your drive to do that? And this is a real kind of game changer, I think, because it truly means that you're not without a car for a whole day. You're not taking it to a garage, which is normally a few miles away, getting a courtesy car, coming home, going back later in the day, which is all just a bit of a faff, really. Yeah. So I think it's one of the areas where we've tried to transform it.
Good point. Yeah, I guess it's just an extra level of convenience that you wouldn't normally necessarily have, would you, with on the servicing side of things? But no, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, obviously, it's incredibly multifaceted. I can imagine the number of different problems you've got, especially dealing with such a complex physical product like a car as well. Like you said, it must definitely keep you on your toes and lots of different things to think about. But I'm, since having had an EV, I'm definitely a big convert, and I think I would find it difficult to go back now, not only from kind of the environmental impact and the fact you kind of feel genuinely a bit better about that, but also just, and the one I've got as well, I just really enjoy driving it.
Yep.
It's great drive, great performance and that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm a big convert. But the thing I'm kind of consistently hearing about the EV market, it's been a lot in the papers recently, is around the actual limitations around the charging infrastructure, both in terms of their efficiencies, but also the number of charge points and the speed of which they're being built and implemented into the network. So, what's your take on that side of things, and where do you kind of see the biggest limitations, I guess, of the EV world moving forward?
Yeah, so I think charging is often called out because it's probably the one thing that people feel is most different from moving from petrol to EVs. And Onto, I think I said earlier, one of our goals is to really help that transition, and therefore that flexible subscription that we offer. And just to be clear, we kind of do it on a month by month basis, which means after 30 days you can give the car back and say I don't want it anymore. So it takes away some of that risk of kind of trying this out, if you like, and really trying to work out whether this works for you. I've been an EV driver since March 21, which is when I joined Onto. And in that 2.5 years, I can say that things have got a lot better and things have kind of progressed, measurably so. I think there's still challenges for some people in certain areas of the country, or people who have certain driving patterns. But all of this stuff is kind of, I guess, working its way through. So from a charging perspective, personally, I charge at home. I'm lucky enough to have a drive and lucky enough to have a place where I can take that car off road, and that means that charging for me is particularly cheap. I have a very cheap overnight tariff that I use for charging my car generally. So I think for me, very very cost effective. Even though with our Onto vehicle, we actually get an inclusive charging as well. I think where people, I think quite rightly probably get a little bit confused is charging is just complicated and it's new and there's lots of stuff out there. And I think we're in a position at the moment where it's fair to say the media is not being particularly helpful towards some of the transitions that we're going through. There's certainly a line that being drawn there where because we're going economically through a bit of a challenging time, that the easiest thing to perhaps do is to say that some of these things are not working and to say let's not spend the money on them. And I think that's that would be extremely short-sighted if we went down that route to that. We're in a transition. We need to get better, and we need to invest in that transition over the next what will be 7 years until 2030, when the government has mandated that we remove the sale of new petrol and diesel vehicles.
Yeah,
it's not helped by. I think we have some big high-profile names coming out there. I think Rowan Atkinson put an article in The Guardian a few weeks ago about how he was a car lover and would go back to petrol. I think then every claim he made in that article was then refuted by somebody else a few days later. And it really isn't helpful that we're kind of getting into this war, I think, around it. Ultimately, one of the biggest impacts you can have on your carbon footprint today is to start driving an EV instead of a petrol and diesel car. It's one of the biggest contributors to your carbon footprint that you can change almost immediately, because you can literally walk away from that car and go and get a different vehicle.
Yeah.
I think charging's a very interesting one. I think what you have to get used to is really changing your behaviour a little bit and thinking about things slightly differently.
That's a good point. Yeah.
If you just approach this in the same way that you've perhaps driven a petrol car, you may have some challenges. I'm personally not the kind of person, when I was driving a petrol car, who would let the empty light come on my dashboard and tell me that I was about to run out of fuel.
Yeah.
So maybe that helps me in this regard, because I've never been used to that sort of habit.
That's a good point. Yeah.
But there are certainly people who they won't fill up until they see that light come on, and when they see that light come on, they know they can go around the corner and they can fill up. That's probably not the case with an EV. You probably want to be thinking of that 25% mark. Okay, it's time to charge. Where am I going to charge? What am I going to do? Because ultimately, I need to do something at that point. But it very very much depends on your driving habits, I guess. Some people who are just commuting 40 miles a day. I've heard a number of stories of people buying hybrids and saying, well, I needed this to kind of, I guess, hedge my bets, hedge the risk of going full in, but I'm only doing 40 miles a day and I'm never using petrol. All you're doing is carrying around a massive power plant in your car that is ultimately not really getting much use, and you've paid for it and other things like that. So it is one of those things that I think needs to change. We still need to, there are still challenges. We still need to do more. We still need to put more charge points out there. I think everybody accepts that, and I think all the networks are starting to roll them out as quickly as they possibly can.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two great points you made there. I mean, one around the fact, with an EV, you can actually charge it from home. So like I say, with a little bit of forethought, you obviously can't fill up a petrol car as easily overnight from home.
Yep.
And it's in my eyes one of the really the big positives, that you could literally pop it on the drive and the next morning you've got full charge. So yes, it takes a little bit more organisation, like you say, but that obviously isn't doable. And the other thing is around, like you say, yes, I totally agree, we're in a transition period, but EVs generally, they're still very much in their infancy.
Yep.
And battery technology is still very early on. It's incredibly impressive now that you can get a car that literally a battery can take you like 300 miles. But I've got a mate who is a battery engineer for BP, and he was saying that essentially one of the biggest gripes around the amount of time it takes to fill up a battery. That's very much limited by the battery chemistry and the battery technology. Yep. But actually, like all standards across the industry now are working towards a 7-minute charge. And obviously, I mean, even now when you take it to a supercharger, it still feels quite quick that you can charge it from like 0 to 200 miles in like half an hour, 40 minutes. Yep. But I guess if it gets to that point where we're talking like 7-minute charges, that then becomes a lot more computable and a lot more fathomable for people to think, okay, well, actually, that probably is quite doable. And we're probably only a matter of years away from doing that. So,
And there's a lot of very intelligent people and a lot of money going into solving those problems because people know how important that is for the future. Once we get a car that has 600 miles or 1,000 kilometers is kind of what I think a lot of people quote. That's ultimately seen as being, if you like, big enough for most people to do what they're ever going to want to do. There's no point in having a battery bigger than that by that point.
No, absolutely that. I mean, when do you ever drive, longer than that in a single haul? You don't, do you, really? So, yeah, absolutely. So we're definitely getting to that quite exciting point. But like you said, we feel like, I think Tesla's definitely sort of led the way clearly and sort of forced the hand of a lot of other car manufacturers. But, there's been a big play, a lot of investment, a lot of money gone into it. We're not going back the other way. So rather than sort of moaning about, things taking longer, we all kind of all need to take a bit more of a forward-thinking approach on it and just, commit, I guess. Yeah. Cool. So you mentioned obviously coming into Onto, you scaled the team, you've kind of built out the engineering and also the product side of the business, which I totally agree with your points there about, having the visibility over both product and engineering, I think is a great thing. But how do you take particular approaches when it comes to scaling technology teams? I appreciate every situation is different and every company you've worked in, I'm sure, a different set of challenges. But do you have kind of a unifying construct that you use to, when you're thinking about establishing a team, setting up a tech function? How does that work for you?
Yeah, so I think coming back to some of the principles we talked about earlier, so ideally what I want to create is small autonomous teams to get really, playing on that autonomous piece. So what that requires, I think, is a few things. First of all, it requires you to identify how you can make those teams autonomous. What area of the product or what product can I get them to own? How can I give them that autonomy, that lack of dependencies on other areas of the system or the people in the team? I think from a structural perspective, it's then about creating those kind of teams around that. So all of my teams are cross-functional teams, engineers, product designers, product managers. They are, we're aiming for a situation where we're creating a high-performing team with that. So I think something like agile coaching is a very important, or coaching in general is a very important skill set that I look to kind of bring into my teams. All my teams, I've always brought coaching in as a skill set. I think once you've got that team, once you've allocated that kind of area that they can focus on, it's then really about getting to high performance with that team. And this scales pretty well. There's large organizations out there that are multiple, many hundreds of or thousands of engineers, and they have many squads out there. I think another area I really think about is like how we work as a team. So what's interesting for me is what's the minimum amount of process and similarity I can ask for between the teams that means that we can operate successfully. So I'm definitely not a high process guy, but I understand there's some need for process once you start to get to multiple teams, once it starts to get more complicated, once it starts to become a bit larger. And it really is how do I bring that down to a bare minimum. And the things that I've found have worked pretty well for us at Onto in previous roles has been around coaching people to think better about what they're working on next. So I think most teams are pretty good at like, hey, this is what we're doing now. If I ask you what you're doing now and I want to understand about what you're doing now, you're pretty good at doing that. But what's coming next? And if that's coming next, how prepared do you have to be ahead of that to make sure that when you do pick that thing up, you actually know what you're going to do, what you're going to build, how you're going to build that. And so with the teams at Onto, we've worked on this idea in the early days of looking perhaps 6 sprints ahead and understanding what's going to happen within those sprints. What do I need to be doing in those sprints to make sure I'm ready? And as the team gets more mature, as it gets more experienced, you can then start to roll back some of that process because actually they start to do the things automatically and they don't need to have that kind of prompt. Those, it's almost like the barriers on a 10-pin bowling alley. They kind of nudges them back in the right direction and helps them to do the right things. And eventually you can take those away and they can be successful. So they're probably the 3 areas: the people, the team, the people in the team, the ways of working, and then specifically how we split that team up from a domains or an area of the product perspective.
Interesting. Yeah, I like the point about the visibility on what comes next. And do you think you take that approach because you have that sort of product mindset simultaneously as well as, the engineering side of things. As a CTO, you're actually thinking about the future roadmap of a product, and is that something you feel is sort of fed from that?
I think it definitely is, and when you're in that position, and that's your responsibility, you have to quickly realize that you need to do that. I think is the is probably the truth. In the early days, it was probably a bit of a wake up, and then eventually you just realize that that's what I need to be doing. I think one of the things that I still spend a lot of time thinking about, and we still spend a lot of time working on, is how we get, probably specifically engineers in this regard, how we get them to feel really close to the problems that they're solving, to have great empathy with the stakeholders working on that problem, and to take that accountability and ownership around that delivery of those pieces. I think delivery is a very difficult kind of skill. Lots of teams tackle it in lots of different ways, and I think it's one that often frustrates both engineers and businesses. Engineers would love to perhaps work more in a world where there's less focus on delivery. Businesses would love to work in a world where there's more focus on delivery, and it's how do you make that kind of work together? Because with my engineering background, I understand the challenges of engineering, that nothing is necessarily simple, that unknown unknowns crop up on a regular basis. But I also understand why my commercial team really do care about when this thing goes live, because they've got lots of other things that are going to roll off the back of that, and therefore there's a true dependency there. So we've tried to tackle that onto by getting the teams to be a bit more cross-functional still. So I really want each individual cross-functional engineering team, engineering product and design team, really needs to work with the other stakeholders, so really make them become part of the team. And my ideal goal is to get to a point where every team has representatives from every team that every discipline that they've been working with. That's where I'd love to get to, but I think it takes a while to build that maturity and to build that understanding that that's where you can get. So we're probably about maybe halfway in that journey at Onto, and I'd love to keep working on that.
Fantastic. Yeah, I love that. I mean, I really, listening to you speak there, I love the fact you've got a very sort of inclusive and holistic view of things as a CTO, and I can see why you've been very successful in terms of achieving what you've achieved there so far. And I absolutely will keep my eyes peeled and riveted for the next stage of the journey, I guess. But no, Ben, really enjoyed the chat today. I think it's been a fantastic episode, and really interesting to get a bit more insight into what is an industry I think we're all becoming more and more involved with as time goes on. But I like to end every podcast with the same question, which is, what has been your favourite piece of advice that you've either given or received throughout your career to date? If you were to pass on to your fellow humankind, what would that be?
Yeah, easy question. My most memorable piece is definitely a piece that my manager at the time, a guy called Des Matthewman, a guy who I consider a friend and a mentor now, gave me when I was going through that transition from being an engineer to being a leader. And he said, look, Ben, this IQ thing is only going to take you so far. You can keep building that IQ, you can keep being better or right about things, but ultimately at some point that's going to stop you from being able to progress any further. Where you've got to focus and where you need to kind of be developing now is on that EQ side, that emotional intelligence side. Because that's ultimately what's going to lead you to be more senior, ultimately going to let you to be paid more, and ultimately going to get you to be more valuable to any organization. And certainly that's something I talk about with pretty much every engineer or person going through that transition, because it's never proven more true than every day I kind of think about that. And every day my role now is purely about emotional intelligence. I very rarely have to go back to that IQ. So definitely the most impactful.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic piece of advice, and I would totally agree. I look back over my career with some of the best CTOs I've ever worked with, and it is those people that have obviously got the foundation clearly from a technical perspective, and they clearly know their chops there, but they're just incredible people, very soft skills, very good at the emotional intelligence side of it as well. And I couldn't agree more on that front. So fantastic. Well, Ben, nothing more remains but to say thank you again for coming on. Really enjoyed the chat today, and wish you all the very best of luck with your continued success at Onto. And I will remain a loyal customer for a good while to come, I'm sure.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a brilliant conversation, and look forward to more feedback on how we can do better.
I will make sure I provide some. Don't you worry about that.
Thanks, guys.
Good man. Take care. Bye for now.